I have a lot of problems with the word values. It seems to me that values means all things to all people. And when you hear people discussing values, it's sometimes very difficult to know what exactly it is that they're talking about, and then you have to work out in your mind what they mean by values. So for me, discussions on values and values education is a little like eating jelly with your fingers. I prefer the word character, and I prefer character education because character is very specific. You see, you can only have good or you can only have bad character. So it's not hard to understand. And also, character is so closely linked to behaviour and one's personality that it makes the whole thing much clearer to me if I talk about character and character education rather than values education. Now, the history behind the word character helps you to understand the depth of meaning behind character. It comes from a Greek word which refers to an instrument for engraving on a hard surface and for the process of engraving on a hard surface. And the inscription that was being engraved had to do with ownership, so it became a hallmark. And there are very close links there to the fact that the process of building character is time consuming. It is not an easy task. I always remember when our children were very small and my wife was always saying or reminding them to say please. And one day in desperation she said to Mother, how long am I going to have to keep saying please? And she said, a long, long time. How long is it going to take to develop character? A long, long time. But when it is developed, it will be permanent. It will be sustainable. It will be life-lasting. And it will be a hallmark of the individual. So character for me is much meatier and meaningful than values. Character is learned from the earliest years, from parents, from the home, simply by watching parents being. It's learned by being experienced and being modelled, being seen, being absorbed, and also being taught the precepts. The curriculum developers of 3 and 4 generations ago and before that always referred to character education as being by precept and by example. And the same is true today. These cornerstone values are communicated through relationships. So the key to character education in schools is not the curriculum, not the resources, but the relationships within the school. The relationships between the staff, the relationships between the staff and the students, and the relationship between the students themselves. It's all tied up with what we refer to as school culture or the ethos of the school. Tremendously important. So teachers, whether they like it or not, play key roles in the development of character. Now, teachers, particularly today, may say, but what about all these children from dysfunctional homes, from what some have called troubled homes? Well, the first thing to remember about young people is that they are resilient. That many of my generation came from backgrounds that today would be referred to as troubled. And many of my generation, in the circumstances that they grew up in, would have had social workers. So the thing is that for children from such homes is to recognise that resilience is important and to build on that resilience and to communicate and to reach out to them and to involve and encourage the parents. My experience is that no matter how inadequate a parent may seem to be, they still want the very best for their children. So the teacher and the school are in it as far as character education is concerned, whether they like it or not. But the present interest in character education, or indeed in values education, is not new. You know, I've said probably 2 or 3 times that character education historically, down through the generations, was one of the core components of schooling. But values education has been around for a long time too, since the 1960s. So there is some research that we can refer back to see what does work and what doesn't work in terms of the school and character or values education. Now, in terms of values to develop character, there are some things that don't work. And the first one is preaching and moralising and exhortation. Remember those school assemblies? The headmaster or the principal got up and preached. In terms of character, doesn't make any difference. But neither does values clarification that was developed during the 60s and the 70s, and I understand is still there in schools. In terms of developing character, values clarification is ineffective. And so too is Kohlberg's values dilemma discussions. Although there's some evidence to suggest that moral dilemma discussion does help young people to become more aware of ethical character or values situations. How then does the school influence character? How does a school implement a program that has some likelihood, some possibility of working? The first is that a school needs to understand how a school can influence character. And I've already indicated what those influences are: the school culture, environment, the relationships within the school, and the precepts that are communicated or taught by the school. And also, a school needs to know how character is learned over time, by being experienced, by being modelled, by being absorbed. The Cornerstone Values approach to character education is not an addition to the school curriculum. It's not being suggested that you add anything on. Remember the Auckland Harbour Bridge and the traffic congestion? They added extra lanes to the sides. They clipped them on. Now that's not what Cornerstone Values is inviting a school to do. Rather, the Cornerstone Values approach is to infuse and influence the total school environment. I like to illustrate it by saying it's a tea bag, because it's going to infuse the whole mug of hot water. Now I have a little tag on my tea bag and it says, Cornerstone Values inform and direct everything that happens in the school. Now, apart from the idea of it being an infusion, there's another important parallel between the implementation of Cornerstone Values in a school and the infusion of a tea bag in a mug of hot water, because the environment in the school has to be conducive and receptive to an infusion at all levels of the school and all activities and tasks that take place in a school. So the Cornerstone Values must influence what happens, no matter whether it's in the principal's office, the classroom, the playground, or the sports field. Well, let me tell you something about the content of the Cornerstone Values approach to character education, because it is surprisingly limited. And it's also not prescriptive. There are only 3 elements. The first is the 8 Cornerstone Values taught by precept and example. The second is the intentional teaching of the law of consequences, which means that nothing happens by accident, that what happens in the beginning determines what happens at the end, that all of our behaviours and actions and indeed attitudes have consequences. Now, that law of consequences is as real in relationships and in communities as the law of gravity or any other physical law. And the other component, the other teaching component, is a 3-step rational decision-making process, because there is a link between your decision-making and the law of consequences, because the decisions that we make have consequences. And part of good character is the willingness and awareness of the consequences and being prepared to accept responsibility for them. So that's why that responsibility and respect are so key to the 8 Cornerstone Values, because they flow on to the law of consequences and rational decision making. So what are the goals of the Cornerstone Values approach? Well, obviously the first one is to build character, and the second one is to develop the ability to recognise good character and to practice good character. Now, they could be referred to as moral literacy. Now, the key to the approach is not resources, it's the school culture, the relationships, what is experienced, what is observed, and what is modelled. Now, within that, there are 3 essential elements if a school is going to be effective in implementing the approach. And the first is the leadership of the principal. The principal must practice principle-centred leadership. If the principal's practices are shonky and questionable, character education will not work in that school. The second is that the approach must have the endorsement of the Board of Trustees, and they must support it in very concrete and specific ways. And then all of the staff, teachers and auxiliary staff and support staff, must be involved in the approach. So what does the school do? It teaches the precepts. It endorses the 8 Cornerstone Values. It advocates the 8 Cornerstone Values, and it models the 8 Cornerstone Values. And if we look at that as teach, T, endorse, E, advocate, A, M, model, you've got team. And the effective schools at implementing the Cornerstone Values approach are schools that operate as a team. The approach must be comprehensive across everything that happens in a school. It must be continuous, not here today and gone tomorrow, not on in the term 1 and off in term 2. The curriculum must be used as a vehicle for Cornerstone Values or character education. And finally, if the school is serious, it must critique its character education. Because the truth is that we do best those things that we're prepared to measure.